Hello, how are you? This is Erni. Um, I am in Hong Kong. I teach at Hong Kong Baptist University. Uh, First, I apologize that I cannot present this physically with you on the panel because at the time of this session, unfortunately, it's 4 a.m. My time here in Hong Kong. So that would make it kind of impossible for me to present or to engage with you. And so I made this video recording. So I want to thank the chair of this panel, Eric Ross, who has kindly agreed to help me play this video for you. And also, if you have any comments or questions afterwards, he would collect them and send them to me. So let me now share the screen. This paper is about or centers on human rights museums as the object of analysis, and is trying to raise some questions about the fact that these museums perhaps are performing what I call cultural forms of governance, and for the enhancement of what can be considered as collective sovereignty of the people, right? This is a new project for me, in which I plan to undertake next year, or sometimes later on towards the end of 2021, when the possibility of traveling for field work can be resumed. So I'm crossing my finger to see if it's possible either later this year or next year. And so this project is very much at a kind of incubation period. All right. Now, this is a project that attempts to critically engage with the growth of cultural actions among governments, urban policy makers, and various kinds of cultural institutions to try to find ways to translate human rights into accessible ideas and practices for the public. So broadly speaking, what I've noticed is that there has been an increasing interest in using cultural well-being and collective sovereignty to promote the significance of human rights in conflict-ridden times, such as our time right now. Now, an important type of relevant project under this kind of thinking that we've seen in the last 3 decades or so is the construction of human rights museums. Let's see if I can do this. Right. I conceptualize human rights museums as a type of public cultural institution that engages, obviously, to collect and also perform curatorial exhibition of artifacts with a threefold mission: to educate or advocate for the mainstreaming of rights, to memorialize past traumas of a country or a city, and thirdly, to engage in what I call a legal common sense. I'll explain that term a little bit later. So looking at these types of institutions, the key questions that would animate my thinking for this project, basically to start off with, are these 3 questions. How do these museums articulate and execute their visions? What broader socio-political factors and also legal norms and mandates have influenced their work? And finally, what cutting-edge museological techniques do they employ? These questions animate this project, which is going to be a kind of cultural survey of 6 selected human rights museums across a particular region known as the Trans-Pacific region. I will say a bit more later on about why those 6 museums and why a focus on that region. The idea is to hopefully contribute to a reframing of museum studies by mobilizing a method of analysis that involves critical legal studies on the one hand and cultural studies on the other. Certainly, immigration, racism, gender violence, climate change, among others, These are the pressing contemporary problems that are changing the foundational roles of museums. As Jennifer Carter and Jennifer Orange, in their 2012 essay called Contentious Terrain, Defining a Human Rights Museology, have argued. They basically said the work of museums is changing radically. They go on to say, as the global rise of museums and museum networks dedicated to the subject of human rights over the past few decades has confirmed, museums can be beneficial to the dialogue and ongoing negotiation of human rights between civil society and government institutions. In this way, therefore, the work of human rights museums as a special type of cultural institutions would need to develop their ethical sensibilities carefully. Yet, a long time ago, Tony Bennett has already reminded us in his important book, The Birth of Museums. This is a 1995 book, as you can see, that the public museum, he reminds us that public museums should be understood not just as a place of instruction, but as a reformatory of conduct, in which a wide range of regulated social routines and performances could take place. So he was drawing on a Foucauldian perspective. Tony Bennett, in that way, places the modern museum at the center of modern relations between culture and government. In this way, if human rights museums exist to educate and to memorialize past atrocities, how will they negotiate with the political conduct of the government and with how that government wants to manage public memories? So human rights museums therefore matter. They are important precisely because they're established with one foot on the people's side, as it were, and the other on the government's side. Some scholars have coined the term museums of negative memory or museums of conscience to call attention to historical trauma that these museums focus on. So instead of celebrating achievements of the past, they memorialize histories of marginalization, injustice, violence, and violations of human rights. And in doing so, they attempt to enjoin governments and peoples in a common conscience. The impulse of never again, which we've heard over and over again in humanitarian discourses, in human rights discourses, that impulse has now built international networks of museums through an increasingly transnational flow of memorial museum aesthetics and design, professional skills of museum management, and urban policy development, etc., that reflect the global transcultural nature of this kind of museums. So in 2010, the Federation of International Human Rights Museums was established. And this clearly attests to what I've been trying to say. Through the work of that federation, we come to recognize human rights museums as networked institutions that by joining hands, they share human rights focused stories more powerfully and mobilize transnational sentiments for cultural justice more effectively. At least that's the concept and that's the mission of the Federation. I think the point I'm trying to point out here is that these museums, it's better not to see them as separate entities. Instead, we need to begin to look at them as networked, interlinked institutions. That's why a regional focus on selected museums has become part of the framework here in the project. My project, however, takes on a special angle, I believe. Human rights institutions are human rights museums are cultural institutions in another way. I'm turning our focus on the fact that a good number of them were created in accordance with human rights legal norms and mandates. A clear example is the prevalence of museums that link the Holocaust to human rights and genocide awareness as a response to various legally derived motivations including, for instance, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights report on Holocaust and human rights education. There's also the Committee on Conscience of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. There's also the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research, etc., etc. In these cases, attempts were made to build museums so as to strengthen a broad, common legal consciousness. Of course, in this case of the Holocaust, so the conscience is around genocide in general, but the Holocaust in particular. This aspect of the project, is in part inspired by some of the work of Jennifer Orange. In her essay, Translating Law into Practice, Museums and the Human Rights Community of Practice, Orange points out that although states as well as transnational legal bodies have agreed to an impressive array of international human rights laws in the form of treaties and declarations for over 70 years now, the way that these laws impact local communities is inconsistent. But increasingly, however, legal norms and mandates are linked to these museums in a direct way. The former, in many ways, have initiated the latter in order to search for ways to change values, norms, and practices of human rights in everyday life. Jennifer Orange uses the framework of community of practice to demonstrate how museums are forming communities to support practices that aim to improve the human rights legal common sense around questions of violence and marginality. Similarly, one of the aims of my project is to examine how human rights museums develop local and even transnational communities to support the learning of what can be called difficult knowledge, right, of new norms around human rights. A legal common sense, I therefore defined it as something that evokes mutually recognized standards of behavior in a community, and is something that is established, strengthened, and disseminated among communities so as to help them learn and reinforce legal norms, both locally and globally. You see, I'm trying to link this general notion of the legal common sense to the work of the museum. And that's why I think the very idea of collective sovereignty or sovereignty belonging to the people of the community comes into play. Indeed, because courts and tribunals had recognized the social value of museums, engaged in practices of archiving and memorializing past human rights abuses, as well as educating subsequent generations on human rights law and best practices, they have increasingly mandated the establishment of museums as part of the remedial package in settlement agreements concerning mass human rights violations. Two examples come to mind. The Museum of Memory and Human Rights that you're looking at, which is in Santiago, Chile, was built in part as a result of a recommendation made by Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The National Commission on Political Imprisonment and Torture, known as the VALEC Commission, was established to document the crimes that occurred under the Pinochet regime from 1973 to 1990. The VALEC Commission recommended reparations to individuals and families, as well as collective symbolic measures. The Museum of Memory and Human Rights was supported as one of these measures. As another example, the District 6 Museum, which is in South Africa, is an example of how museums can support the practice of initiating legal claims. The Land Restitution Act under South Africa's new constitution became the legal mechanism through which people could return to the homes from which they had been removed. Researchers show that the museum provided space for community gatherings as an institution partner for the District 6 Beneficiary Trust and the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, which orchestrated the legal process of land restitution and the Land Claims Commission in South Africa. apartheid. I believe studies of human rights museums can approach the question of the relation between these museums and the popularizing of legal common sense through raising the following questions. And so these would be some rather central questions for my project now. So, for example, how have museums helped to realize the legal goals and recommendations issued by courts? How have they used their archival expertise to support the evidentiary work of legal investigations of rights abuse? For example, those performed by Truth and Reconciliation Commissions or domestic and international criminal tribunals? Or have they been created as memorial sites themselves, right? These museums, where legal tribunals did their work by becoming a place-based visual and documentary archive of the tribunal's work, even after the latter's legal work has been completed. For example, the Sierra Leone Peace Museum is an example of a museum that stands after the tribunal closed. It was a project of the government of Sierra Leone and the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which was established to adjudicate crimes against civilians that occurred during the decade-long civil war there. In many ways, therefore, I suggest that we see human rights museums as sites of law, which enact the very signifying forms, which in turn constitute socially salient distinctions about various things, such as what sort of what counts as harmful acts, what is justice, right? And through this kind of signifying forms, having to do with kind of legal language, legal political language, that somehow can provoke new practices through which the meanings of rights can be debated and even disrupted. So rather than being static establishments, human rights museums are dynamic legal institutions in the quest for social influence. So that's basically the conceptual kind of backbone, if you will, of the project. Now I want to talk very, very quickly, very briefly, because I don't know how much time I've spent here, to talk about the regional focus for this project. As we know that when we're talking about kind of global trade or geopolitics in a particular region, spanning over a number of countries, for example, the importance of transnational human rights is often sidestepped. We're talking about the changing meanings and values that shape people and groups in mobility in the region because of military conflicts or migration or political exile or other or geopolitical or economic changes. But then, some of you would remember that around 2016 to 17, the discord over international trade surrounding what was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, makes explicit the necessity and timeliness for a gateway region to play an impactful role in shaping that region's understanding of human rights struggles. Many of us will remember that by January 2017, during the Trump era, the United States withdrew from that agreement, from the TPP. The other 11 TPP countries, however, agreed in May of that year to revive it and even reached agreement in January 2018. By March 2018, the 11 countries signed a revised version of the agreement called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And 6 of the countries have now ratified this agreement. That includes Australia, Canada, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, and Singapore, right? All along the Pacific arc, if you will. And that agreement has now come into force for those countries since the end of 2018. Now, it's important to look at the TPP not just as a trade pact, because the trade pact is linking all of these countries in order to promote better lives, right? Which includes questions of human rights across that region. Take Canada as an example. This is an important country, obviously, in the Trans-Pacific region. In 2012, there was a report from the Citizenship and Immigration Canada project that said that by 2031, 59% of the population of the gateway city of Vancouver will be visible minorities who are predominantly Chinese, South Asians, Filipinos, Koreans, and West Asians. Vancouver School Board successfully implemented a leading-edge sexual orientation and gender identity inclusion policy, which is now being widely adopted in other municipalities in the province. Now, this successful mainstreaming of social inclusion should not be taken for granted because we need to remember the long history of exclusionary practices in the province of British Columbia. From the imposition of a head tax on Chinese migrants leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923, to the dispossession and internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II, to the banning of books depicting same-sex intimacy by a municipal school board in 1997. So in other words, the city's remarkable emergence, or transformation really, from a history of discrimination to becoming a so-called model inclusive city owes in no small part to its cultural landscape, which includes Asian Canadian cultural activism, a vibrant culture of film and many other creative practices, and importantly, a vocal support for the construction of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in nearby Winnipeg. This is the museum in Winnipeg. Now, other important nations and their key cities along the Trans-Pacific corridor have similar histories as Canada in terms of human rights struggles, human rights, sufferings. There have been various kinds of cultural and political responses to each country's own kind of human rights history. If you think about Melbourne and Perth in Australia, or Wellington in New Zealand, or Guangzhou in South Korea, or New Taipei City in Taiwan, Santiago in Chile, Bogota in Colombia, Los Angeles and San Francisco in West Coast US, so on and so forth. These represent important cities that not only dot the Trans-Pacific region, but they also present to us, a picture of interconnected episodes of discriminatory and exclusionary government policies around issues of migration and refugee mobility, and even movement of political dissidents along or across the region. Right? Just not to mention the fact that these countries share the dark histories and memories of colonialism, or the Pacific War, or the Cold War. So in many ways, the project that I'm looking at by focusing on them, on the Trans-Pacific region, is a project that tried to look at and theorize the transnational cultural impact of human rights museums in forming a kind of trans-Pacific cosmopolitan citizenship arising from legal common sense and human rights consciousness more generally. In many ways, museum studies needs to be connected with the now pretty vibrant field of trans-Pacific cultural studies, right? The term trans-Pacific, some of you would know, was initially used in Yun T. Huang's study of Asian and North American literary encounters as a corollary to transatlantic, a well-known concept of works such as The Black Atlantic by Paul Gilroy, that unsettles nationalist epistemologies and calls attention to histories of chattel slavery and racial capitalism across the transatlantic in Gilroy's book. So we're using the transatlantic kind of framework, the Black Atlantic framework, and there's been a kind of attention to look at similar kinds of national history in the Trans-Pacific, in the Pacific area, right? And the field-defining book is this book, Trans-Pacific Studies, Framing an Emerging Field, right? So I think I won't dwell too much longer about the term Trans-Pacific. I think that I just want to point out that even though this field is something that I reference, I also want to note that too much of the work in this field perhaps has been dominated by US-based area studies scholarship. So in some ways, we need to kind of remap it a little bit. So let me close. Right? These are the 6 museums that I've chosen. As you can see, they are in Australia, Taiwan, South Korea, Chile, Los Angeles, and Canada. And they were selected for their historical span, very good scale. These are all national level, many of them national level museums. Their richness of contents and activeness in public engagement. Some of them are pioneers before the current trend of memorial museums. And together they address a unique set of human rights issues that shape the Trans-Pacific region. Once again, through looking at their collections and their attention to issues of immigration, resistance movements, indigenous issues, and of course, the aftermath of the Cold War. So, of course, when I can fly, can be able to do field work, and when travels resume, I hope to be able to visit these museums to look at their exhibitions, perform close readings of many of their artifacts, photographs, exhibition design, audiovisual elements, etc., and also to perform a kind of institutional ethnography of each museum. Right? Of course, that involves in-depth interviews, hopefully with the museum director and their staff in each case. All right, so I think that this should conclude my presentation. I hope that I have given you a reasonably clear sketch of this project. If you have any comments or questions for me, please feel welcome to send it directly to me or to give it to Eric Ross. Thank you, Eric, once again, and thank you all for your attention.